The water that we're looking at currently in the scene was created just by using the water tool from underneath landscape. The next thing I'd like to do is create an ocean. Now, ocean does what it sounds like. It actually does create an ocean in your scene. So when we select on this button and then turn the ocean on, what's going to occur is that we'll suddenly see an ocean covering our landscape. So let's begin. Click on Ocean On Off, and now we can see all this water just flowing over our entire site. The only thing that's still above water are some of the higher areas that we would have sculpted when we were creating the scene initially. Now, I will say this, that if you didn't sculpt very high areas of land, then it's possible that your entire area is now completely covered with ocean water. Now, the good news is that that can be adjusted. But before we do, one other thing I want to point out before I make adjustments to this water, and that's the fact that there are options here for things like brightness, which can completely change the color of the ocean, or different colors, color 1 and color 2. In this case, it's going to be a blue and more of a gray color. What that's going to allow for is you can then adjust the color of the water to be whatever color it should be for the area that you're in. If it happens to be in a red clay area, maybe there should even be a slight red tint to the water. That would mean you could then change it from being more of a blue to being more of a red. Maybe you might want it to be just a slightly bit more white to the water. You could start to adjust those colors so that the water took on those properties. Now, I am going to leave the colors just the way that they are. But the first thing I wanted to show is that there is an option here called wave intensity. And if I move that over all the way over to the side, you can start to see this really thick, heavy, dense water really moving with the waves. Think of this as being maybe the Pacific Ocean. Now, if I start to move it over in this direction, really placid, very calm waters. Maybe it's not even an ocean. Maybe it's a large lake. You get the idea that you can adjust the way that the waves are in these different areas. Then there's this turbidity. And what I can do is I can start to move it over in this direction or move it in this direction. Notice the colors and how they change. What I've pretty much figured out is that color 1 will start to show up a little bit more over toward the left-hand side, and that color 2 will start to show up a little bit more as you move it over toward the right-hand side. So depending on exactly how you want to mix those colors together, you can use this command in order to make those kinds of adjustments. Then you have height. Now, if you wanted to have a scene where you were underwater, you just move it all the way over to the side, and you'll probably never get above all this water unless you really set your mind to it. If you wanted to have a scene with virtually no water in it at all, you can move the height all the way over to the left-hand side, and then you wouldn't see the water at all. Now, all these adjustments are being made just by clicking on the correct bar and then holding down the left mouse button. Now, if I very slowly start to move this bar over, I'm just holding down my left mouse button while clicking on the water's height. Notice over here in the background, the water is slowly raising up. Soon it'll raise up into some of these other lower areas that I have here. If I want to raise it a little bit higher, I can. If I wanted to now take a look at what we have over in this area, I can just spin the wheel on my mouse and then move closer to these areas and see how the water's filling in. If I wanted it to then fill into this area, I could just raise the height a little bit higher. You get the idea. You can create different levels of water in different kinds of water conditions just by adjusting the oceans. Also, I wanted to point this out. See how the water's coming in here? In any place you have a landmass, the water actually is starting to foam up. in these areas where it's touching that landmass. If I start to make adjustments here to this turbidity, you can then start to see the color start to change with the water. So based off of where you're standing in relationship to the water, you might want to make adjustments to it because it may look a little different depending on where you're located at. And then you have, of course, the wave intensity, which if you start to really raise that up, you can start to see how you now have rough waters close to your land. And it looks like at any moment it could splash up onto your land where you're currently standing at. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click and then look around in this direction. Now we can see that we have sort of a cliff up here looking down on this water source. Now, usually once I have my water in place, this is where I finish off my land. How do I do that? Well, I come over here to height, and then I start to smooth out these contours. So I'll use the smoothing tool. I'll click here, and I'll slowly adjust it, smoothing out my land in these areas. Otherwise, you start to get some of these really unnatural looking areas. In fact, I'll increase the brush speed a little bit so it'll go faster. There we go. We can start to see it smoothing out these areas just by moving the brush around in these areas. And this kind of makes sense. This is area that's been underwater for quite some time. Having some of these rough edges, weird peaks, probably makes very little sense in a lot of these areas. These are things that should be somewhat smoothed out just by the effects of time. Same with some of these rocks over here. Having corners are okay, but I want to weather them down a little bit by smoothing out those edges. I'll come across here, cut it down a little bit. I think I'll get rid of that rock altogether. And you get the idea now. Now we have these little islands out here, a tiny little peninsula, and the water goes off into the distance. And if we wanted to use our water tool at this point in order to add more water into the distance, we could, or we could just lower the land way out here in the distance. And by lowering the land way out into the distance, we could actually create even a larger ocean kind of area. Because the lower that the land gets in those areas, the farther out the water can actually go. In my experience, I might take a half an hour to actually do my entire site and clean up the area so I get exactly the experience that I want in a specific area. But with a little bit of time and development, you can create the kind of water and ocean scene that you want by either using the water or the ocean tools.